If you just read the front pages of the newspaper, you'd think ESG is almost dead because some people are sort of running away from it. Where are we right now? Is there a reduction in enthusiasm or commitment?
I think there's some confusion around it. Let's just sort of go back here for a minute. The real genesis of ESG was post-financial crisis and the Great Recession, when there was certainly ample reason for the world to wish that corporations were a little clearer on their value proposition to their shareholders, to their communities, to their employees, to their customers, etc. So ESG is kind of a sort of next generation of corporate responsibility. And everybody had some version of corporate responsibility in their frameworks. So what we're really talking about that changed is the E. And the E is largely a part of, I think, a pretty universal acceptance that climate change is real. The scientific community has been very compelling. Most of global corporations, local corporations, and most governments in the world agree we need to address climate change. Now, how we do it, the pace we do it at, that's become somewhat politicized. And then the other thing is so there's the ESG, how you behave, and then there is the ESG funds. Well, the ESG funds are a whole other thing. The ESG funds mean a fund and how it performs, and it's like any other fund.
That distinction Anne Finucane makes between ESG tied to how a particular company behaves and ESG simply reflecting how a company is affected by climate change, regardless of what it does, is an important one that is often confused, according to Professor Andy King of Boston University.
Most ESG funds are what I call light green funds, which they're using ESG scores to pick stocks and put them in their portfolio. And most of them are not very different from other comparable types of funds. If I think about what a manager might do with ESG funds, that I think is very valuable. And you can be looking at what you're doing in terms of the risks that you face, and you could be making good investments on how to change your firm. At the public assets level, I think the effect is much more minor, and it's very difficult to have a higher return. And as we said, it's very difficult to have any impact with that.
At this point, the problem is not a lack of voluntary commitments on the part of companies trying to address climate change.
The top 10 companies in the U.S., whether you're looking at revenue, market cap, net income, however you want to define it, most of those companies have made commitments to decarbonizing their companies, demonstrating the decarbonization. Most are committed to net zero. Their sort of end dates may be a little different, and their descriptions may be a little different. But the top companies are there. Even the fossil fuel companies, which I know is more controversial, are making commitments. Now, their focus is more on carbon capture and sequestration storage, and less about new forms of clean energy. But I defy you to mention a company that hasn't put something forward in this effort. And, 2023 was the hottest year in history, of recorded history. I don't think there's much argument that we're looking at extreme weather, water shortages, food shortages, a rise in sort of climate-related diseases like asthma. So I don't think there's an argument about the science. I think most companies are committed, but some of the tools they thought they were going to have been held back a little bit. And what I mean by that is everyone talked about blended finance. So that meant that companies and governments and multilateral development banks would work together. So that would mean multilateral development banks would actually have to change considerably. Those changes are slow coming. Companies thought that they would have carbon credits or carbon offsets, and I'm focused on that in my own work. Well, those have been slow to come because the NGO community has really resisted them, and really is sort of problematic because there's plenty of proof that it's those companies that are doing the most in just using carbon credits as a delta to close the gap that are making the most progress. So some of the tools companies thought they would have are no longer, either not there or they're slow coming.
One of the tools Professor King says could help companies meet their climate commitments would be something adopted by the European Union 2 years ago.
A carbon tax would help. The great thing about things like that is that then the information is carried in the price. And so people are able to make much better decisions. Or carbon tradable permits or something like that would be wonderful as well.
Absent governmental action such as a carbon tax, he worries that unstructured and unregulated voluntary commitments to limit emissions may mask the need for more fundamental change.
That is a big fear of mine, and we've seen that before in other areas. After the famous Bhopal accident, which killed so many people in India, the chemical industry tried to self-regulate, and it didn't really work. I have to say, as an academic, the research suggesting that the ESG is substituting for political activity is not very strong. But it is my experience that says I think that could be happening. I'm looking out the window at the Charles River, and it is clean because of the Clean Water Act that was passed in the 70s, actually under a Republican president. And it's a marvelous thing. I'm breathing better air because we had a tradable permit system for sulfur from coal burning. And that's a marvelous thing. And if we had a carbon tax, people would be moving away from a carbon intensive kind of fuels and things that they're doing. So all three work well. You got to do one.
So have we made progress? Let's take the E and the environment. Have we seen actual results in terms of carbon emissions coming out? Because I've seen conflicting reports about that, exactly how it's worked. Thus far, it's been mainly voluntary, if I'm not mistaken. Have we made progress in the real world?
Yeah, we have made progress. Well, it's voluntary in the U.S. It's not voluntary in Europe. And it is sort of double-sided in China. So let's just go out to in, farthest out. China is making enormous progress in green technologies, batteries, rare minerals, wind, solar, etc. I mean, they own the market in terms of solar paneling. But they also, erect coal plants at a pace that is just remarkable as well. So they are a tale of two cities. And their commitment is that they will start to reduce their carbon footprint after 2030. Whereas the rest of the world is really making real progress. The United States has made real progress since 2005, 2007. And by 2030, they hope to be about half of what they were in the early 2000s. And we seem to be on pace for that. This is a journey. We're talking about the end of this century. We're talking about net zero by 2050. Could we miss that by both temperatures, this 1.5 degrees cap? I think so. Could we be post 2050? Maybe. But I also think that there's a real commitment in terms of developing new sources of clean energy, wind, solar, battery, etc. Maybe not as fast as everybody wants, but with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Act, these are incentives that I think when they're ironed out, there's still complications with them. When they're ironed out, they are incentives to do more broadly and more quickly.